Dear students, dear colleagues, welcome. Welcome to our lecture series. We continue today with an on-site lecture. That's really nice. It is my pleasure to welcome my colleague from the law faculty at Maastricht University, Dr. Marijn van der Sluis, who is assistant professor in constitutional law and specializing in what he calls green constitutionalism. The topic of his lecture today is very much about money, as the title of his lecture already has indicated. Of course, as soon as money is involved, proper procedures, legal accountability is necessary. In other words, it's super important not to only discuss environmental legislation in this lecture series and the application of it, but also other EU initiatives that have as an aim to further the green transition. So I'm very happy, Marijn, that you have proposed this topic. It's really important, and I give you the floor.
Thank you. Good afternoon and welcome everybody to my lecture as part of this lecture series. Thank you, Marijn, for the invitation to contribute to this lecture series, and also thank you for helping me over the last few years by now already for introducing me into this topic. It's really nice that I can now contribute back to your lecture series. You've helped me so much as a constitutional lawyer to become familiar with EU environmental law. So what we're going to talk about today is the EU climate funding. The European Union, more specifically the European Commission, promises that over the period of 2021-2027, the EU will spend 658 billion euros on climate action. And that is a figure that I think already on its own should grab our attention. So, from when is this? This is from the European Green Deal, the launch in 2019 of the first von der Leyen Commission, who made green the centerpiece of her program. And in that, she promised, in that European Green Deal, as part of the European Green Deal, she promised to spend 30% of the EU budget, including Next Generation EU, which we'll return to spend 30% of the EU budget on climate change, to fight climate change here. So that is something that became the centerpiece of her. The Green Deal is the centerpiece of the first von der Leyen Commission, and the budget was a crucial part of that. Now, why else should we care about this claim, the 658 billion euros? Why do we care? It's a lot of money, but we're lawyers. We don't necessarily care about all that money. So why, as constitutional lawyers or as lawyers, environmental lawyers, why should we care about this topic? So this is then the recent paper from the European Central Bank, in which they outline the need for funding for the climate transition. So the European Central Bank has calculated how much money we need to spend collectively, invest collectively into the green transition, where they say this is what is necessary, this amount of money is necessary in order to get the green transition off the ground. So, first part of care, well, because it is an essential part of the green transition. Another reason to care is because it does something to the European Union. Here we see a graph of the spending of the European Union in main policy areas in the EU budget over the different years. We see a decline of common agricultural policy, stabilization of territorial and cohesion and social policies. We see a lot of other programs, but climate does not even fall under this. And we have a small budget for the European public administration. So where does climate fit into this? And what does it do with that budget? If you promise to spend 30% of your budget on the EU climate, what does it do with this graph? What does it do with how the European Union spends its money? So that is, I think, in short, why we should care. So for me, there's also a different, so also to explain a little bit the background of the talk today. I am a constitutional lawyer with an interest in EU constitutional law and particularly the economic aspects of it. So I have written extensively on the European monetary integration, so the euro, and then recently switched more and more to climate. But the key question that I'm examining in my research is how can law, or particularly constitutional law, contribute to climate change mitigation? So where does law, constitutional law, come in when we talk about how to transform an economy? How do you change an economy so that we fight climate change? So that is my particular background. And the reason I got into this topic specifically is because I'm working together with Lilian Surdi, a colleague here at Maastricht, Professor Lilian Surdi, I should say, on a book on governing through funding in the European Union, where we examine how in different parts of EU law, European integration, the EU budget is taking on a more prominent role. So we examine how in different areas of law, the budget is used to steer policy. How does the EU govern? So I, as an editor of the book, have an overall picture, but also contribute to one chapter on this specifically. Another disclaimer I need to make with presenting is that I'm talking about how the EU spends its money. And the EU spends its money on climate change, 650 billion euro in total. Now, researching that amount of money doesn't come easy. And this is very much research in progress. And there isn't already a lot of research to build on. So a lot of this is relatively new research. So my job today, as I see it, is to connect the big picture, so the bigger questions, with the more nitty-gritty. And if you feel that you're losing track or things are not particularly clear, the chances are that it's not you, that it's the topic, and that it hasn't really been clearly researched enough by me yet. Sorry, let's get going. So the key question, so what am I going to talk about? So the first question is pretty mundane. Where does the funding go? How do we actually get to that 658 billion euro? Which programs do we use? How do we use that money in the European Union? The second question is, does climate funding displace EU environmental law? So what is the relationship between funding, using money to achieve policy objectives, and using regulations, directives, EU law to achieve those objectives? Do we think that EU climate funding is now more important? Does it mean that we have to perhaps pay more attention to that instead of actual rules, or is something else going on there? As a side note, I see that there are a few participants online who do not all seem to be aware that they have their camera on. So the third question is climate funding changing European integration? Where does EU climate funding come in, and how does it change how Europe is integrating? So those are the three questions I want to tackle today. So the first part, so setting the target. So when I said the EU wants to spend 30% of its budget in a wide meaning here on climate, where does that come from? It started with the MFF, so the multi-annual financial framework, so the long-term EU budget for the period 2014-2020. And this was in a time where climate action in the European Union was not taking off that well. There were a lot of policies, but there had been a few, of course, there was the euro crisis, and many countries were not particularly keen in investing or doing more on climate. And then there was one commissioner who said, well, I think this is something we can promise. We can say that we can do 20% of the EU budget on climate action. I think we're almost there, and I think we can make it. So if we promise it, we might just get there. And it got snuck into the EU budget, so it worked. So that goal, the target, was set at 20%. At the time, it was a political objective. It was something that both the European Parliament, the Commission, and the Council, they said they embraced that goal. Now, for the period of 2021-2027, it was the goal was set more ambitious. The Commission proposal first said 25%, but in the end, it became 30% target. of total expenditure to support climate objectives. And this time that 30% is not just a political objective, it is also found in what we call the interinstitutional agreement on the budget, so an agreement between the Parliament, the Commission, and the Council, and that includes a yearly reporting from the Commission on this target and a sort of review correction mechanism that if the Commission feels that they're falling short of the 30%, they will make improvements. And in various pieces of sectoral legislation, we see targets popping up. So the main idea, of course, when this was proposed already for the 2014-2020 MFF, was the idea we are already doing as the European Union a lot. We are already spending a lot in different areas that is somehow climate related. So the key idea to reaching that 30% or that 658 billion is through what we can call environmental mainstreaming, an obligation under EU law, Article 11 of the TFEU, an obligation to integrate objectives of EU environmental law in all EU policies. And so this is what was done. It was said, okay, also in the budget, we need to integrate more climate. So this is then the picture that the graph that the European Commission uses. They say, how do we get to that 658 billion euro of climate funding? And I'm going to talk about, so there's a lot of different programs, and these are not even broken down. You can even break this down a lot further into a lot of smaller funds and targets. But this is a general overview, and I'm going to talk about the main three. So the Recovery and Resilience Facility, Common Agricultural Policy, and European Regional Development and Cohesion. So how does that work? How do they think that for those funds, we get to, well, at least a large part of the 658 billion euro? So we start with a cohesion policy. So these are very old, well-established parts of the EU budget. They seek to compensate member states and regions in those member states for the effects that happen as a result of European integration and the establishment of a single market. So who is winning and who's losing in European integration? And you use cohesion policy where you say, we see that there are regions that are struggling. And for a lot of these, a couple of these funds, so there's cohesion funds, and there's a lot of different funds. One specialist calls it a galaxy of EU financing, and because there are so many different bright stars, so many different funds. But then there's one regulation, the Common Provision Regulation, which lays out a few basic rules for a number of these funds. And that is where most of this climate tracking, climate marking comes from. So what this Common Provision Regulation does, amongst other things, it also does a whole range of other, lays on a whole range of other rules. It sets up a methodology for climate tracking. It has an annex, and in that annex you can see here's how, if money is spent on this particular theme, it counts for 40% towards climate funding. So if you spend 10 euros on it, 4 euros will be counted as climate funding. Or in some cases, there's a 100% coefficient. It is something that the European Union borrowed from the OECD, called the Rio markers, which were developed to track how countries were funding climate change mitigation through development funds. But the EU said, hey, that works quite well. We can also use that in the European Union, and they adopted it as an annex to the Common Provision Regulation. So this is what that looks like. You just have fields and tables and tables and tables of 0 or 40 or 100% coefficients. And you can see it's quite, I think it goes around 200, if I'm not mistaken, different intervention fields. And they say if it's part of that project, then it will count for 100%. If it's part of that project, it will count as 40%. So you may need to make all these distinctions. what counts as 40%, what counts as 100%. And if you already look at these two, I want to point out here, at least one of them, it has something about air quality and noise reduction measures. I do not necessarily see how noise reduction measures would count as climate change, as contributing to climate change objectives. And in some cases, improving air quality even has a negative effect on climate change mitigation. It's a bit contradictory. The bad air and air pollution can help us fight climate change. So even though we might want cleaner air, it might not necessarily help us with climate change mitigation. But here, air quality and noise reduction measures count for 40%. So you see, when you get to the how do we spend 658 billion euros on climate change interventions, you need to come up with all these tables and markers. How are we going to count what we are currently doing if it's climate change mitigation or not? And a lot of these are a lot less controversial. But this is the kind of administration you're getting into when you embark on this project. So I thought, and I also was curious for myself, what is it that's then actually done? What can I see? Can I see projects about what is actually funded through these funds? When does it actually get to climate change mitigation? So I found a nice study from the European Parliament on the cohesion policy and climate change. And in it had a section where it said, oh, there were examples in the south of the Netherlands for the European Regional Development Fund on research and innovation in small and medium enterprise. So I thought, that's interesting. So you dive a bit deeper and you get into these databases of the European Union about what kind of projects are then funded. And then you get a database and you can look on the map and you can see, so in Maastricht, what did we fund with these European Regional Development Funds? It was between 2016, 2018, a project on full aesthetic solar roofs. Installing solar panels, not just on top of a roof, but integrating into it. I think this was even before or around Elon Musk got into it. So for 2016, 2018, this was a nice little project. I think it got around 100,000 euros. And then you start searching a bit and you Google a bit and you find their Instagram page, and they had indeed been installing solar roofs. So I thought, okay, let's see what do they actually do. Here in Maastricht, under EU climate funds, we've been installing climate roofs. Okay, so not a lot of projects are a lot bigger than 100,000, but I thought this makes it nice and tangible what the EU is doing. So that's through cohesion policies. For cohesion policies, we have these lists of markers, and we can say, oh, for cohesion policy, when it's on improving train network, it counts for 100%. If it counts for air reduction, it's 40%. It becomes more difficult in the second policy area. That is common agricultural policy. And this is also, for me as a researcher, this is the most scary part, because it is by far the most technical and politically sensitive part. So I'm going to keep it a bit of an overview here and not go as deep. But there's two pillars of the common agricultural policy, mostly related to either direct support for farmers or market interventions, or it concerns rural development. And where climate change mitigation then comes in is, for example, through conditionality. And there are certain requirements that need to be fulfilled in order for a farmer, for example, to receive support from the European Union. And those requirements, for example, also now include the requirement that every year 4% of the area needs to not be used for agriculture and needs to rest, and you improve soil conditions and you make sure that the soil keeps more CO2 in the ground. So you have these types of requirements that are imposed before someone can receive funding from the common agricultural policy, and therefore it is counted to a certain extent towards climate. There's now also different eco schemes where farmers can get extra funding if they, for example, use a specific type of grass or they have more flowers in the field. So there's specific requirements, and also here you get quite technical. But the Common Agricultural Policy constitutes around 100 billion of the 658 billion. So it's a large pot of money for climate change mitigation. And so the third one is the Recovery and Resilience Facility. That's part of the Next Generation EU. It was part of the EU's response to the economic effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. It was a new type of funding for the European Union. It was created next to the already quite significant, but small comparatively to the budget of the member states, next to the EU budget. So it was on top of what we were already doing in the European Union. And it allowed the European Union to borrow a lot of money and then offer that money either as loan or financial support to the member states. And it is around 800 billion euros in total. And it works a bit differently than the EU budget. Under the Recovery and Resilience Facility, member states need to draw up a plan where they say we are going to reform certain parts of our economy and we're going to invest in certain parts of our economy. And when we do so, that's when we get the funding from the European Union. So it is different than the EU budget where there's a program and then there's funding allocated, so then it's funding to cover certain costs. No, here you get funding if you have achieved the milestones from your plan. And so where climate then comes in is an upfront requirement that plans must dedicate 37% to the green transition. And here they use the word green transition, but what they actually mean, and they talk about biodiversity as well, but when you actually get to the counting of the measures again, it's clear that it's only about climate. And in order to see again, does it cover climate or not, they thought, well, we already had those lists available from the Common Provision Regulations, and we're going to also use them here. So we have the same type of methodology to determine whether or not something counts as climate funding. Now, since there was this large pots of money with the Recovery and Resilience Funding facility, it was nice because when the next crisis hit in the European Union after the invasion by Russia of the Ukraine and energy prices shot up, there was also a demand for the European Union to respond. And they thought, oh, we have a nice pot of money. It's not completely used yet. So let's rededicate a part of that funding and invite member states to resubmit plans in order to use that funding to improve energy production, sustainable energy production. So that's called RepowerEU. So a part of that funding of the Recovery and Resilience Facility was then also used again to respond to the invasion of the Ukraine and to boost the sustainable energy in the European Union. It also did something else, and it's a bit outside of the scope of the lecture today. It triggered a discussion about where should the funding for the European Union come from. Because if you borrow 800 billion euros, at one point you're going to have to pay it back. And preferably with new kinds of money for the European Union. And that's where I triggered a discussion, for example, on funding that now comes for non-recycled plastics. And there's also talk about increasing the own resources of the European Union, for example, through the emission in relation to the emission of CO2. So another example, I thought that let's take the Dutch plan. The Dutch plan submitted in response to get the funding from the Recovery and Resilience Facility. So this was the Dutch plan. It's a nice 500 pages long, and I thought let's pick something that this was transport. And there's a few of them. There's a rail traffic management system, smart mobility. And I thought the most bureaucratic, strange one is intelligent wegkantstations. And you think, oh, what is that? It's those little boxes on the side of the road that both count how much traffic is coming, but that also control the matrix above the highway of how fast you can go. And they were old, they needed to be replaced. So they wanted intelligence ones. And I thought, okay, it costs around 250 million, sure. So we need to do that. So let's use the funding for this. So you think, okay, an intelligente wegkantsstation, does that count as climate spending? That's a tricky one. And then you go through the 500 pages and you go to the description. And then at the bottom it says, one of the consequences of this policy is that for the next years, we can steer traffic a little bit more efficiently. And as a result, we have less traffic jams. Well, that's great. Less traffic jams is less emissions of CO2. Great. So if we go at how we count climate spending, we see digitalization of transport, roads, 0%. Digitalization of transport when dedicated in part to greenhouse gas emission reduction road, 40%. So the intelligente stations, they count the spending of that counts for 40% of the EU, towards the EU climate funding goal. So we see a few problems. So for the three biggest funds, we see a few issues. The first is what I would already call the definition of climate action. So if we talk about climate policy, we usually distinguish between climate adaptation and climate mitigation. But this funding introduces a third category, and that is mitigating the effects of the policies to mitigate climate change. Because one part of the funds that were part of the cohesion policy was the just transition mechanism. We also try to help regions that are affected not just by climate change, but by climate change policies. So if there are regions where you close coal mines, which might be a good idea, that region is heavily impacted, you spend money to compensate and help that region, and then that also counts as climate spending. So there's basically already a third category. And then I think it starts to get murky. Of course, it's related to climate policy, but is it fighting climate change? Not sure. Then there's inaccurate labeling, which I think I showed examples where we're not really sure, does this really help with climate change mitigation? And so when I said this is a lot of new research, one source that helped me a lot in doing this research is the European Court of Auditors. And they have had a few nice reports on this topic, and one of them was from 2022, researching the 2014-2020 EU budget and the climate spending. And the subtitle of that report of the climate spending in the 2014-2020 budget was not as high as reported. So that, I think, drives the message home. They were not convinced. They said, of that 20% target, we think you got to around 13%. And I think even there, they might have been a bit optimistic. So, inaccurate labeling is a problem. But there's another issue. There is no negative budgeting. There is no sense of how does the EU budget contribute to climate change. Also noted by the European Court of Auditors that if you spend money as a European Union on improving or enlarging agricultural production, that in itself has effects on the emission of greenhouse gases. So perhaps if we just stop the entire funding, that's a better idea than including some green conditionality. And they say, well, you can't account for that. We are not accounting for that, at least at the moment. So that is a bit of an issue. So if we count how much the EU is spending on climate change mitigation, perhaps we should also have a look at how the EU budget in itself is already contributing to climate change. But that is not part of the claim. And I think a fourth problem that we see is what I would call displacement, where the European Union might now not fund certain projects anymore. And probably they're not investing in coal mines. That's probably not done under EU funding anymore. But perhaps it changes to the member states, where the EU is helping member states and imposing certain requirements what you cannot spend that money on. Well, helping the member states, again, might offer up opportunities to do that kind of investing that the EU doesn't want to do. So there's also not a clear sense of what the overall effects are of putting these requirements on the European Union. So I see a couple of problems when we talk about, is the EU actually doing all this climate funding? So then the second question, how does it work with the relation between funding and EU legislation and EU environmental law? And for that, we're first going to have a quick look on more or less the structure of EU climate law legislation. And at the top, we have an actual European climate law. And it sets the goals for the European Union as a whole. Climate neutrality by 2050, targets for 2030, and also the requirement to set a target for 2040. And then we see more or less a split in shift responsibilities between the member states, so the countries, and the European Union itself. So for the countries, for the member states, there is what we see an effort sharing regulation. And that line specifies how much of a reduction every member state should achieve. And achieve in certain sectors, those not covered by the emissions trading system. And it says the Netherlands should have a reduction of, I think, 45%, and Bulgaria around 10% compared to 2005. And it distinguishes between different responsibilities for different member states. And it's an idea, some countries have historically more responsibility, or they have more opportunities, they are richer, they can do more. So there's a distinguishing between how much each member state must do. And in order to do so, there are national energy and climate plans that member states must submit how they are going to achieve their specific goal. And of course, they also have to implement a lot of the rules coming from the European Green Deal. So a lot of the rules that are adopted on the EU level, they have to be implemented by the member states. So a large portion of where actual climate policies are placed, where the difficult decisions have to be made, is in the member states. On the EU level, it's a bit different because we have one big policy that the EU kind of takes responsibility for, does it itself. It's still a directive, but it's mostly really the EU doing that, is the emissions trading system. And of course, it adopts a lot of the rules from the European Green Deal. And the EU also does a few minor policies with regard to climate, such as green competition law, and we see green monetary policy. But the bulk of the responsibility is on the member states. And they have to do a lot of the climate policies. And here again, a report from the European Court of Auditors, they have identified that one of the main problems in reaching the 2030 goals, that it's unclear where the member states are going to get the funding. How are they going to fund their own transition? How are they going to implement the rules for which they're responsible? How are they going to execute their national energy and climate plans? So a lot of the difficulty lies with the member states. And I think that's where, so how does it align? How does the funding align with the regulation? I think here we see a very nice the funding following the rules. So there were a lot of rules and there were a lot of responsibilities placed on the member states. They had difficulty implementing and achieving their goals. And then we see a recovery and resilience facility that says, here is a big pot of money. You determine where it's going to go. It needs to go for 37% towards climate. So basically, countries got the money to implement their plans. So I think it's not a displacement. It's really the European climate law and the effort sharing regulation and all these rules on EU level that determine where the responsibility lies. And now the funding is more available in order for the member states to execute their plans. So I would say it is not a competition between the rules and the funding, it's the funding helping with the implementation of the rules. So that is a bit more the bigger picture. And then if we zoom in on the actual rules, we see, for example, in the RF regulation, a requirement that indeed the plans must be consistent with national energy and climate plans. For the Neighborhood Development and International Cooperation Instrument, EU Foreign Affairs, we see a requirement that union funding may not be incompatible with the NDC. So what a country submits under the Paris Agreement as its own target for emission reduction. And it may not promote fossil fuel investments. And that, of course, well, then you think, okay, that is quite the strict requirement. Under the promoting fossil fuel investment, there is an escape clause, more or less. But focusing here on the requirement that union funding may not be incompatible with a third country NDC, difficult to see how it sounds great, but it's difficult to see when funding would be incompatible with a country's NDC. Because an NDC is a country saying, here's how we are going, here's our target for emission reduction. Well, and how can you say if a specific project would make that impossible? So it's very difficult to see whether or not union funding is actually incompatible, because they are targeted such different levels. One is really projects, and one is a whole country's goal in order for emission reduction. So that is difficult to see. We see the same thing popping up in the Common Provision Regulation. And the objectives of the fund shall be pursued in line with the objective of promoting sustainable development, as set out in Article 11, taking into account the UN Sustainable Development Goals, the Paris Agreement, and the do no significant harm principle. So the Paris Agreement I kind of already covered here. Let's talk now about the do no significant harm principle, which is a principle in EU environmental law that we see mentioned a lot more nowadays. If you've been following the news recently, and the Commission's proposal for deregulation under von der Leyen's clean industrial policy, also we see that the do no significant harm principle pop up. And in a lot of the rules that dictate how the EU should spend its money, we see that do no significant harm principle pop up. So let's talk firstly where it originates, where most of these rules refer back to. So they actually refer back to the taxonomy regulation. And the taxonomy regulation is a regulation from slightly before the European Green Deal. And it's a set of rules that should help that companies define their green economic activities. And so it helps us to distinguish what is a green activity for a company and what is not a green activity. And that should help with determining for investors that want to or should do more with green investments to determine, okay, I should invest there, but not there. And the taxonomy regulation basically sets two requirements. The first is your economic activity should help with a specific economic objectives, environmental objective, such as biodiversity or climate change mitigation or adaptation or reducing pollution. And on the other hand, it should do no significant harm to those principles, to those objectives. So it shouldn't do a lot of harm to biodiversity, or it shouldn't do a lot of harm to climate change mitigation. So as a principle, in the taxonomy regulation. That sounds quite nice, right? Do no significant harm. It's a good idea to do no significant harm. But as a legal principle, it is a bit difficult. So if we say you should do no significant harm, well, we also don't make criminal laws that say you should not be not nice to people. And it's also a good idea to not be not nice to people, but do no significant harm as a legal principle is a bit difficult. So in the taxonomy regulation, that is of course acknowledged, and there is something called technical screening criteria. And that is the Commission outlining when exactly something contributes to an economic objectives or environmental objectives, and when it is considered to do significant harm. And here again, we see an enormous administration, so around 350 pages just for one of these objectives, where we say, I took one, for example, the manufacture of cement. When you do that, does it actually do anything for the environment? Maybe adaptation, it might help. But also, when exactly does it do significant harm? And then they just outline for your cement production how much CO2 you can emit per ton of gray cement. So it's just hundreds and hundreds of pages of outlining how you should do your economic activities that it is not considered to do significant harm. So that is under the taxonomy regulation. And that is, on the one hand, we have a principle that's difficult, but the technical screening criteria that are very specific. Not always sure how the technical screening criteria relate to the principle, but as a mode of governing, okay, you make a list of when something is considered acceptable and when it is not. But for all these different funding tools, the technical screening criteria are often not mentioned. So we're stuck with the principle. We're stuck with the principle, do no significant harm, but without having a clear idea of when exactly that is the case. So for the RRF, the Commission had to come with an additional set of instruction of when something was considered to do significant harm to the environment. And that was a lot less fine-grained than the taxonomy regulation and the screening criteria. And it was also very easy for countries, I think, to surpass, to avoid running into these problems. So this do no significant harm principle with regard to the spending of EU funding, it's a difficult one. I do not necessarily see it functioning at the moment. So then the third question, how does this climate funding change, or what are its effects on European integration? And there we see a side effect of climate change always being a secondary objective, right? I said Article 11 TFEU, in all the EU policies, there must be environmental objectives integrated. And that kind of means for all these different tools, we see climate change objectives being second. There's another objective, and then climate change mitigation comes. And for a lot of these funds, you get the feeling, does this really have to do with climate change mitigation? Does this really do that much? So that was a bit of a negative side. And here I want to point out a bit more of something positive, perhaps. Namely, that climate funding seemed to enable European integration. When the pandemic hit, there was a big question, how is the European Union going to respond? If we took the response from the European Union to the Euro crisis, that was a very strict one. That was one that focused on the fault of the countries in question. We could have said to Italy when the pandemic hit there first, you were not prepared. Actually, the Dutch finance minister said that in quite unfortunate terms. But that could have been a response from the European Union. We don't want to give you money. You should have been better prepared. But this time the response was different. The response was, we want to help out. We want to help out with quite a significant pot of money, 800 billion euros. combination of loans and financial support. So the response was different, but just giving or just setting out a large pot of funding, making that available, was not on its own very convincing, because why would we just give that funding? And I think that's where the climate funding comes in, because it offered a very persuasive reason to use that funding, because we had just announced the European Green Deal in 2019, and 2-3 months later, we have the pandemic. So you have an economic necessity for the funding. We need to help countries and restore confidence. But there was another reason for European integration. We just promised that we would do a lot more on climate change mitigation. So the reason was available. There was an underlying motive already to offer that funding. And we see exactly the same with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. It was a big economic crisis. Energy prices skyrocketed. Now, if you say energy prices skyrocketing, that is perhaps not the circumstance in which you think, oh, that's a good reason to do more green policy. No, you want to lower prices and you want to help countries with their energy security. But instead of toning down the green objectives as a result of the crisis, which is what happened during the Euro crisis, we don't have money, so let's not do too ambitious green policies. The Russian invasion of Ukraine actually, because there already was that pot of money, RepowerEU. And I think we see the same thing now with the green industrial policy. Yes, definitely climate objectives are now second again, but they are again second. It is always part of the narrative. So I see the climate funding now with the green industrial policy not as disappearing, but as staying on the background, providing extra motive for new European integration. So when we talk about climate funding, it's not just does the funding work, or could it be administered a little bit better, or is it really convincing that it's 658 billion? That's one question, and that's something we should be critical about. But the other aspect is, how does it change European integration? How does having that motive, having that reason there, how does it help with European integration? So another question for me as a constitutional lawyer, how are these funds all administered? How does this really work? And I think what comes up if you go through all these documents, and I said, these are 500 pages and there's 300 pages, it is an incredibly technocratic view of the green transition. This is really a technocrat's dream, perhaps, of labeling every single investment that way or that way. There's a lot of power for the European Commission, but it's a very technocratic power. So if we talk about how is the Union spending this money, we should perhaps also say, are there other ways we can think of that the EU can use climate funding to have a more direct impact, to have more visible projects ready? If you say that you spend 658 billion as the European Union on climate funding, we can also ask, but where are the big ticket items? What is it that you really do? Where is the European high-speed rail network that you could build? Where are those types of projects coming? Is that a different vision? So another issue is, this is also with the book that I'm doing with Professor Tsuri, we identify several techniques of how do you steer policy. And one that we see here is that labeling and marking. So how do you do that? And it kind of works for climate, but it also has its limitations. So if you start marking or labeling every single euro you spend, and you say, okay, this is a cohesion policy, but it also does something for climate. Well, in that neighborhood and development area, we see a large overlap of these different markers, because they also said 85% of the neighborhood policy should be spent on gender equality. And then you go look at when does neighborhood and development policies promote gender equality? It was already building a school. Well, I think building schools is perhaps a good idea, but I'm not always sure it immediately relates directly to gender equality. And you get to the stacking of these percentages. So perhaps if we say that the EU spends 658 billion on climate, maybe it spends another 800 billion on equality and another trillion on economic growth, and all these figures start to dazzle a bit. So maybe there is also a limitation on how much of these stickers you can place on all this funding. So, conclusion. So I think this is my first conclusion. Something interesting is happening. That is my first. And that is what is happening. I think there is definitely, it is a large part of EU climate mitigation policy. The way the funding is used is a very large part of how the EU is trying to combat climate change. There's a lot of problems with it, but even if that 658 billion is not, if it's not that total amount, it's still a lot of money. And we see it shaping both the EU budget and European integration as a whole. So that's why I'm at the conclusion, something is happening. Something interesting is happening, and it is something that we spend some attention on. So this is a question that I'm struggling with a bit. Is this greenwashing? So when you see me put out the labels and this is not really climate spending, that's not really climate spending. So then the question that ultimately comes, is this a form of greenwashing? So the easy question then to ask, is the EU spending 615 billion euros on climate as they claim to do? No. That's not happening. I can't say as an academic that claim holds up. There is no, that is not what the EU is spending on climate action. So is it greenwashing? Perhaps a bit, but I would find that too negative a view on what's happening. If we just call it greenwashing and say, oh, the EU is not living up to its promise, it's making its budget greener than it is, I think we're missing the dynamics behind it. And we use the term greenwashing, for example, for companies that promise to do climate, but they don't do anything. It's just greenwashing. And I think for the European Union, that doesn't really hold, because there is, in many cases, a very earnest attempt to do something, to really examine over time how the EU budget should contribute to climate change mitigation. You see the reports from the European Court of Auditors and the response from the European Commission, and there's improvements on how to do the climate tracking. So there is something happening. So is it greenwashing? I don't think so. I wouldn't call it that. I think that's too negative. And finishing up, we now have what's going on for the current multi-annual financial framework. The proposals are coming up soon for the next period. The Commission has promised to do it either slightly before or probably right after the summer. And the question is, are they going to come up with another 30% pledge? Last time they said 25, it turned out to be 30. But the European Court of Auditors has remained quite critical over time whether that's going to be managed. So maybe they'd say, well, it's not realistic, let's go back to 20, but that would kind of be an admitting failure. So maybe they say, oh, no, so green, everything is so green, we don't have to track it anymore, which might be more earnest, but probably would also lift the pressure a bit. And the big question is, how is the EU budget going to develop? Are they going to more in the direction of the RRF with member states making plans and then getting money? Or is it more the European Union spending money on very different projects like in cohesion policies? So how is the EU going to develop its budget? That is going to be the main issue going forward with the question of how EU climate funding is going to develop. No, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Marijn.